As we've seen with this prior example of transaction level controls involving the sales function, auditors rely on the output of a company's IT system when they're trying to gain an understanding of these different controls. So it's really important for us as auditors to understand internal control in an IT environment and to focus on the different benefits and risks associated with IT systems. So we can see here the different benefits and risks. These are some of the more prominent benefits and risks that we'll run across when dealing with companies' IT systems. And as far as benefits go, some of these you may already be aware of just from your general experience working with computers and different systems. IT systems can provide greater consistency than if we were manually entering the same transactions. That consistency is a big plus. It leads to less errors overall, and it allows us to automate a lot of different processes, which is great. It could save time. There might be some work, some investment up front to get the system up and running, but it could save hours and hours of manual labor, so that's another big positive. Also, having these IT systems in place as opposed to manually doing the work helps us create the information faster, so we can act on it more quickly as a manager or a person running the organization, and it gives us the ability to monitor activities more efficiently because we're getting that real-time information across our desks more quickly. Now, those are all great things. Those are wonderful benefits of IT systems. Of course, as an auditor, we're interested in what could possibly go wrong because of these systems. So there's a number of different issues, and this list is nowhere near comprehensive. Various companies can have different issues that pop up surrounding their IT systems. This is just a list of some of the more prominent types of problems that you might encounter with IT systems. Cybersecurity, of course, is a huge threat to companies' information technology. So companies want to be diligent in monitoring any risks associated with that. So that's a downside of the IT system. Yeah, it may be quicker and more efficient than doing the work manually, but it may be more susceptible to outside influences wreaking havoc on our company and our information. And also unauthorized access to the data, destruction of data, or changes to data by unauthorized users might be easier to be done with an IT system as opposed to a manual type system. People from halfway around the globe can possibly authorize or gain access to our data. So that's a big concern. That's a big downside of utilizing IT systems. So auditors, when they look at a company's IT systems, they want to be aware of the different risks that are involved. These are a couple risks that are, faced by most companies operating today, but depending on a company's business model and the industry they're in, they may face some very unique risks. So auditors need to be on the lookout for that when they're trying to gain an understanding of their client's internal control. This here is a flow chart showing how information flows through an IT system, and it's kind of highlighting where the different controls are in place. So we have what are called IT general controls, which are kind of high-level controls that affect information throughout the company. And we have also what we call IT application controls that are more transaction-based. So if we have an individual inputting data into the IT system, typically there's these overarching controls as well as controls associated with that one particular system they're using at a particular point in time. Now, if we think about the output of the IT system, there's two different main forms of output that we can kind of look over to make sure that the system's operating effectively. We talked a little bit earlier about exception reports. So again, if we're looking at a manufacturing company, their assembly line, we're trying to make sure they're effectively utilizing inputs. An exception report might show waste or spillage. So if we're a manager on the floor there, we can get this report from the IT system and follow up and see kind of what the issue was. Likewise, there's output that isn't necessarily exception reports, but output that could still help us figure out if there's any issues with the information being processed within the IT system. So users could have control over this manual output. So basically the IT system is producing some type of output, but then human beings are kind of scanning over it to see if there's any issues. So I want to talk about the IT general controls and then the application controls for particular transactions in a little bit more detail. First off, to look at the general controls, we need to have a basic idea of the different types of general controls that are widely recognized. So we have 5 different types of general controls here. The first one involves the data center and network operations controls. This is basically getting back to that idea of segregation of duties that we talked about earlier. In this particular example, it's the segregation of duties amongst people working in our company's IT department or the IT department of the company that we're actually auditing. So again, we only need, if only certain people need access to particular systems, we really want to safeguard that and make sure we only authorize those people who need access to actually have the access to those systems. Also, system software acquisition, change, and maintenance controls are very important. And this is safeguarding our operating system, basically. So the applications that oversee the operation of our hardware. All right, so these are going to be operating systems. We want to make sure that our operating systems don't have any issues going on. And 3, 4, and 5, these are kind of talking about more controls for individual types of systems. So program change controls basically refers to the fact that we want to test new software before we introduce it to live data. So maybe some of you have worked at companies in the past where you've experienced this, that where the IT department's trying to make a change to one of their systems, so they do a little bit of testing on it before it goes live. I've seen this before in education where the school is trying to update their different platforms such as Moodle or Blackboard, and they do this a lot of times in the summer when there's less traffic on those platforms. So they try to test it out when there's not a lot of users online. Then they look for errors and they kind of roll out the real deal application after the testing goes through. So we call that testing program change controls. Access controls, these are things like controls over giving access through passwords. So we're all familiar with that. You might have access to an application every 60, 90 days. You're asked to re-enter your password. That's considered to be an access control. And the last general IT control is the application system acquisition, development, and maintenance control. And basically this is ensuring applications such as software overseeing sales or our inventory software system are actually authorized by higher levels of management to have any changes done to them. So 3, 4, and 5 kind of go together, and all these controls work together kind of in tandem to ensure that the information flowing through the system at a very high level is going to be properly maintained, and it's going to be properly scrutinized by the folks in our IT department. Now, we also have application level controls. So these are controls that are on a more micro basis, and there's 3 major categories of these application controls. We have input controls, processing controls, and output controls. So let's take a look at some examples of these 3 different controls. There's various different controls depending on the specific systems you're talking about. So these are some of the more popular ones you'll see in practice, but again, this is not a comprehensive list. Notice under input controls, these are controls surrounding the input of information into our IT system. So some of this stuff you're familiar with, again, just from your use of software in the past in your own personal or work lives. Missing data check, that's an input control to make sure that all the information you need to enter actually has been entered. So if you're asked to enter your 10-digit phone number with your zip code and you only put 8 digits in, all right, the missing data check control is going to catch that. A little error message will pop up. All right, so that's one way to catch any problems in the input of information into the system. Also, we have this limit reasonableness check. If you think about an example dealing with payroll, maybe we have workers entering how many hours they worked into some type of software system that's going to process that information to determine their pay for that period. Well, you might have a situation where there's a limit of how many hours they could work, right? Nobody's working 150 hours in a week. So maybe you might have a control that anybody that enters over 2 digits as the number of hours, you're going to get a message kicked back, or over 50 hours, or whatever the case is. So this is a control on the input side before the information even gets into the IT system. We have these controls in place where we're not going to allow bad or invalid input to be entered into the system. Now compare that to processing controls. These are controls dealing with the processing of information within the system. So we could see here we also have a limit and reasonableness check. Notice this example kind of goes hand in hand with the prior one. Basically, we could have somebody that enters the proper amount of hours. Maybe they worked 47 hours. They type that into their system. They have to do this maybe every week to get paid. All right, the processing control would make sure that the system's actually calculating how much they should be paid properly. So, if they make $20 an hour, right, we want to make sure that calculation's being done correctly. So this is a control that makes sure that the calculations done within the system is actually working. So this could be a control. There's different ways to go about doing this. You could have manual verification after the fact to make sure that the information entered was properly calculated. We could look at that person's input of hours. We could calculate how much they should be paid, and then we can kind of do that by hand and compare that to the output of the system. So we could periodically kind of sample some of these transactions to see if this output, the output generated, was actually calculated correctly. And then the last type of control we have in terms of IT application controls are output controls. All right, so this is looking at the data output by the organization's IT system and making sure that it is effective. So output data, one example here, we can compare output to source documents. So let's say we manually create a sales invoice, and we kind of create that, then we enter it into the system, and the system, let's say, is going to create shipping documents for us. All right, so we talked about the idea of a packing slip earlier. So maybe we have somebody, the person who was in charge of making a sale to the customer, they input that information. All right, so maybe they have documentation of what the sale actually was. The system creates the packing slip, so we can go back after the fact, look at that packing slip, check it, make sure it actually matches, all right, what we have on that original entry of the sales invoice. So lots of different IT applications, controls in practice. These are just a few examples of what you might see on the job as an auditor. The key idea I want you to take away from this is during this risk assessment stage, auditors are going to be thinking about all these different controls and how well they function. And then later on in the audit, if they decide they want to test the controls, they're going to look at these controls individually, all right, to get a feel for how effective these controls actually are in practice.